Well, the headlines themselves were shocking enough. Rival biker gangs in Texas confront each other with murderous gunfire, terrorizing a Waco, Texas neighborhood. But in the aftermath of this violence, a second story is emerging. Anger over the way the outlaws were treated by police. Now, for example, men who were being arrested for a killing spree were only loosely guarded as they awaited processing. The video speaks for itself. Now, compare that to scenes in Ferguson, Missouri last summer when demonstrators were met with militarized force. And in Baltimore, protests over the death of an unarmed man in police custody did spill into looting, but this was property damage, not murder. Again, police responded in great force. And it's not just the police reaction that differed between Waco, where whites were the alleged criminals, and places like Baltimore and Ferguson, where blacks were mostly protesting. The media language used to describe the events differed dramatically. While protesters were called thugs, the Texas shooters were simply members of bikers clubs. Well, civil rights attorney Charles Coleman Jr. has been examining this issue and wrote about it in The Root. Charles, there's a prism of prejudice here that is distorting racial reality in America. I think most people would think that's the case.
I do think you are right when you talk about that, Julian. A lot of what has been going on in terms of the disparity within media coverage between black crime and white crime has really distorted the conversation on race in a lot of ways. And part of it comes actually from within our own community, because we have bought into this thug narrative as well, in the sense that the term thug now is almost being used exclusively or to the exclusion of other races when it comes to violence that we see coming out of other communities. And the Waco shootout is a perfect example.
Well, double standard here in this. We see it in sports in terms of fighting. As I mentioned many times here, you go to a fight and a hockey game breaks out and there's not much talk about it. In this particular case here, the narrative still doesn't seem to have changed, although there has been pressure by some media outlets to say, hey, look, let's examine this. What would make the change here for you to get people to look at this differently?
Well, I think that it's a matter of holding media outlets accountable. I think that, number one, within our community, we have to be consistent in terms of how we have this discussion amongst ourselves to make sure that we don't buy into that narrative and sort of fall into the trap, if you will. But we also sort of have to continue to hold media outlets accountable. And you raise a good point, especially when you talk about these sporting events, because we've seen time and time again, whether it's Pumpkin Fest in the Northeast or Lexington, Kentucky, after the University of Kentucky lost the basketball game, or Ohio State, or what have you, where students, they burn things, they set cars on fire, they break windows, and they're referred to as revelers or rowdy kids, or they're blowing off some steam. But in Ferguson, when you have young people who are throwing rocks or even protesting peacefully, they get broad stroke labeled as thugs.
Well, you have a news flash here, Charles Coleman Jr., and you know it all too well. There's supposed to be some sort of congregation in New Mexico, about 20,000 bikers, clubs, gangs, whatever you want to call them, descending on there. And also, there's been some talk of retaliation against the police officers in Waco, Texas. I'm just wondering if the media is going to converge upon New Mexico with this biker gathering, as it were, and see how they cover that.
I'm not going to name any names, but I do realize—
Name them.
I couldn't help but watch the coverage of what was going on in Waco on some other networks, even though I stay tuned to Arise. And I wondered to myself, where are the Don Lemons, the Geraldo Riveros, the people who seem to be so interested in these crime stories when they happen? When it came to this motorcycle club and these biker gangs, no one was there. And it took a lot of pressure from the outside community for them to even cover it. And I'll make another quick point. Just as you talked about the way that people have been pressuring the media, it's very interesting to me that now all of a sudden the face of the biker gangs has emerged as this one black biker who's a former law enforcement officer.
I think it was a former San Antonio police officer turned, I forget, custodian or whatever he is. We see him like with a half black, half white beard, and his face is plastered all over everywhere. I find that perhaps not so surprising. I guess the question here, Charles, is America so cauterized now to turning its face against the shame of race and the intolerance that certain people have, that no matter what happens, they may never see reality? In other words, the sky could be blue, but they're still looking at it as pink.
You know, the great black philosopher and psychologist Frantz Fanon, coined the term cognitive dissonance. And that's exactly what we're dealing with when you talk about race in America. For so many people, the idea that America really does have the serious race problem that we as black people know that exists, the idea for them would almost shatter and fundamentally break everything that they know or believe about America and its values at this point. And so it's easier for people, rather than to deal with that and try to wrestle with it, to just simply reject it.
Right, and of course now we have a black president, and some of my white friends, and they're really good friends of mine, say, get over it, Julian. There's no race problem in this country. In the wake of Ferguson and everything that we've seen here, they still don't particularly see it.
Right, and to me, yesterday's announcement of the Balvo verdict in Cleveland, Ohio, just speaks directly to that. You have 137 shots. You have as many as 17 shots coming from one officer who stood on the hood of a car, and 2 unarmed black victims, and an acquittal. And so when you start continuing to have these things happen, in order for you to really suggest that it's not about race, you have to almost be turning a blind eye to what's going on out here.
Well, I call it quarterization, and that'll have to be the last word on this. But Charles, I'm sure we'll be coming back to this again, but maybe there'll be black biker gangs that will gain national attention. I don't know. Anyway, nice suit.
Thanks, Julian.
Thank you for joining us.
Take care. All right.